As was mentioned, the topic will be about Quran, right? The Quran and how it guides our life. So many of us know the story of the Quran, how it was revealed, right? The Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, every Ramadan, when he reached a certain age, or during his Ramadan, you go past your 20s. In your 20s, most people are looking for like stability, they're looking for identity, they're looking to figure out who they are, who their families are, what they value. Then in the 30s, they're starting to, build themselves up and put themselves in a strong position. But during this time, the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, every Ramadan, before Ramadan was Ramadan, right? Before Ramadan was the month of fasting, the month of community, the month of coming together. Before Ramadan was what it is to us, he would still go every Ramadan and just desire to be alone. Every Ramadan, he wanted to be alone. So as he would do, one Ramadan, when he was 40 years old, he goes to a cave, right? Many of us, we can't be alone, right? Many of us, the issue now is that even when we're alone, we pull out our phones and we're not alone. But the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ desired to be alone. And it's something admirable to take that time to reflect. So the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, he's taking this time to be alone, and he goes to this cave we know now as Hira. There's something very special about Hira. The Kaaba at this time was surrounded by idols, right? This is before Islam had came over and took back Mecca. So at this time, the Kaaba is surrounded by idols. But when he would go to the cave of Hira, he would be far enough away from the Kaaba so he wouldn't see the idols, but he'd be close enough to the Kaaba to see the Kaaba itself. So he would sit night after night and he would just look at the Kaaba and make dua to Allah. He would make dua to Allah before he even really knew what dua was. But he would cry and he'd ask Allah that I know for a fact, Ya Allah, there's no way that, idol worship is true. Ya Allah, I know that worshiping an idol is never the path. And Ya Allah, I know that you're out there. So give me something. And the weeks became months, and the months became years. Year after year, he would do this. And one year, something changes. He's up in Hira, and he sees a light. Maybe he sees a star, and the star, the way we look at helicopters and they move, the star was kind of moving. And he's like, this is a little strange. And he goes out, and he sees something that covers the sky. So imagine, I try in these moments, we should try to imagine seeing through the eyes of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. For those of us who have been to Hira and seen the scene, seen the mountain, you know that it's a flat area, literally on top of a mountain. So it's a very strong hike up. So he exits his little, nook of Hira, and he's just on top of the mountain. And he sees this thing that covers the sky. In a city, you don't really see the sky, right? You come to a city, you just see lights everywhere. You don't really see the sky. But those of us who've been back home, had the opportunity to be somewhere elevated, you know how truly great and huge the sky is. Imagine you're on top of the tallest building in a city. How much of the sky you could see. Except that whole sky is covered by wings. And as we know it, Prophet Muhammad ﷺ didn't know, but we know is the angel Jibreel. Angel Jibreel comes down. And he says the famous words, read, Iqra. The Prophet Muhammad ﷺ has this famous response, Ma ana biqari. I am not someone who can read. I can't read. And then this angel comes and gives him a hug, but the hug is so tight, the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ says, Hatta balagni al-juhd. That till the point where I was passed out, almost passing out. And then he lets go. And again he says, read. Again, the Prophet Muhammad said, I can't read. And again, he squeezes him 3 times. Right? We know the story. And the Quran is revealed. And this moment, the moment Iqra goes from the angel Jibreel to the tongue of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, humanity as we know is never the same. Why? Because we have been given the everlasting word of God. At that moment, our relationship with God could never be the same. And it's clear to see the effect of the words of God upon the people. The people of Mecca were those who, the Prophet Muhammad said himself, they were the worst of the worst before Islam. They were the worst of the worst. Aside from just worshiping idols, right? If we could, it's the worst thing to do is associate a partner with God. But let's say, we ignore that one thing. They were people who, we think it's unimaginable, they would bury their daughters alive. There's actually a hadith from a Sahaba in which he says that he had gotten married and he had had a child and it was a girl. And he was so happy to have this daughter. He was so happy. But his tribe only accepted sons. And in this Sahaba's tribe, if they had a daughter, it was the father's job to bury her alive. He said at that moment he couldn't do it. So he goes with his family and they become excommunicated. Him, his wife, and his daughter. Now for them, for us, in America, you're kicked out of your family. It's a very harmful thing, but at the end of the day, you can move to another city, right? You can go somewhere else, you can start a new life. For them, that's all they had. So he moves from the hierarchy of Mecca to the outskirts of Mecca. And every day, things get harder and harder, day by day, year by year. Until a moment he has, and he says, enough is enough. I can't handle this anymore. So this person who would later accept Islam, this Sahaba, he goes and he takes his daughter in his arms. And he says himself, my daughter asked, where are we going, Baba? And he said, we're going to go play. And he goes in the outskirts of Mecca. And he starts digging a hole. And he says, I'm holding my daughter in one arm and I'm digging the hole in my other arm. And whatever dirt and sand would get into my beard, his daughter would go and clean the sand and dirt out of his beard. Imagine. Due to the societal pressure, what he had to do. And then you can figure out the rest of the story, right? What happened. This is the state of the people of Mecca at that time. Right? Openly, people were being tortured and abused. Openly, people were being killed. And no one would lift a finger. And then the Prophet Muhammad receives the message of Islam. There are many stories you can point to say, okay, this is the effect of the ayat of the Quran. But there's no story more powerful to show the effect of the ayat of the Quran than the story of Umar. Before Islam, who is Umar? Umar is he's the guy. In Mecca, he is like the guy. He's from a powerful family. They say about Umar that when he would ride a horse, his feet would drag on the ground. Of course, that's like hyperbole to build up his character, right? That's the type of person he was. Tall, handsome, strong man, a warrior. Umar was he was set up to be the next leader of Mecca. So one day Umar, he's a young man, he's not Muslim, he has no touch of Islam yet. All he knows about Islam is that, there's a guy named Muhammad who goes and says there's one God, and that's it. So Umar one time, it's the middle of the night, and as young men who are off from work and don't have God, what do they do, on a Friday night? When you guys drive past it on the way, they go and they go to party. So Umar radiallahu anhu, at this time, being that he was non-Muslim and he was a young man, he goes to party. And he goes and he tries to find, what they would call a liquor store, right? Where he gets his regular, alcohol from. He goes to the liquor store, imagine Friday night, everyone's trying to party then. He goes and it's empty. And he's like, what? Why is the store closed? So it's just so weird. And then he's like, you know what? Instead of just going to the liquor store, I'm going to go to my friend's hangout. They're going to be partying already. They're going to go. I can just go hang out with them. And he goes to his friend's hangout, and it's empty. No one's there. And he's shocked. He's like, how is it a Friday night and no one's partying? What's going on? Is it like a final tomorrow I didn't hear about? So he's like, okay, let me just, so he's bored. He doesn't know what to do. He says, let me just go sit by the Kaaba. I'm just going to go chill at the Kaaba. So he goes to sit by the Kaaba, and he sees the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. For him, it's just Muhammad. So he sees Muhammad, and he kind of knows a little bit about, he has this thing called Islam, and they worship one God. And he thinks to himself, I heard Muhammad reads really good poetry. Right? What we would call the Quran, they thought it was just poetry. So let me hear some of this poetry. But Umar doesn't want Muhammad to know that he's interested in Islam, or Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. So he goes up to the Kaaba. For those of us who've seen the Kaaba, they know the black exterior of the Kaaba is just a cover. Back then it was red and white. So he goes up to the Kaaba, he goes underneath the cover of the Kaaba, and he starts scooting around. He wants to go next to the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ without the Prophet knowing that he's there. So he kind of scuffles around, he goes, and then now he's standing next to the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, but he's like up against the wall of the Kaaba. And the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, as you can imagine, the voice of the Prophet, something more beautiful than what we can imagine, he's reading Surah Halaqa. And Umar is amazed. Umar, despite the fact that Umar was a warrior, radiallahu anhu, despite the fact that he was a warrior, he loved poetry. Especially a poet named Antara ibn Shaddad, if you know his poems. He used to love war poetry. So he hears the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ reading poetry, what we know as Quran. And he's like, it blows him away. It's like nothing he's ever heard before. And he's like, what am I hearing? Right? What I don't understand any of, this is so beyond anything I can understand. So he says to himself, Umar says to himself, what am I hearing? And then in Surah Haqqa, Prophet Muhammad ﷺ is reading, and he says, إِنَّهُ لَقَوْلُ رَسُولٍ كَرِيمٍ. These are the words, this is the speech from a noble prophet. So imagine he's asking the question in his head, and he's hearing the answer in the surah. So he starts freaking out a little bit. He's like, what's going on? So because the Prophet almost answered his question, he's like, wow, this is some really impressive poetry. He's like, wow, this Muhammad guy is a really good poet. And then for those of us who know Surah Haqqa, Prophet Muhammad continues, وَمَا هُوَ بِقَوْلِ الشَّاعِرِ قَلِيلًا مَا تُؤْمِنُونَ. This is not the words of a poet. Little do you believe. So he's like, Umar is just standing there. He's like amazed. He's like, Muhammad doesn't know I'm here. He doesn't know I'm listening. Yet he answered my question twice in a row. So if it's not poetry, if this is not like the Prophet Muhammad being a really good poet, it means that he can he can read the future. He's like a soothsayer, which is something they would believe back in the day, or back in the time of Jahiliyyah, back in the time of ignorance. They would believe that soothsayers could kind of tell the future. So he says, you know what? Muhammad is a soothsayer. He knows what I'm thinking, and then now he's answering the questions. And the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ reads the ayah. It continues, وَلَا بِقَوْلِ كَاهٍ قَلِيلًا مَا تَذَكَّرُونَ. He says, it's not the words of a soothsayer. Literally in the surah, it's not the words of a soothsayer. Little do you remember. Remember God. So Umar again is like, what's going on? So he's like, in his head, again, he hasn't said the question yet, but in his head he's like, what is this then? If it's not poetry, if it's not magic, if it's not fortune telling, then what is it? And the ayah continues, تَنْزِيلٌ مِّن رَبِّ الْعَالَمِينَ. That this is a revelation from the Lords of the worlds. So at that moment, Umar freaks out. He's like, I can't handle this, and he leaves. And as many of us do, for a couple of days, he feels like this spiritual high almost, where he's like thinking about it a lot. He's thinking about Islam. He's thinking about what he heard, something that really deeply affected his soul. But he just says, you know what? The days pass, and he forgets about it. He goes back to his drinking ways, and he moves on. Now, sometime later, he as Islam grows and grows, and the persecution of Muslims grows and grows, he sees a family leaving Mecca. Right? He's a family that he kind of knew a little bit. He's seen them around. So he was like, why are you guys leaving? What's going on? Like, what is it, like financial difficulties or what's happening? And he goes to the family and asks this question, and they say, Umar, your people, meaning the non-believers, are oppressing us, the Muslims. And we can't take it here anymore, so we have to leave. And Umar, even though he was at this point non-Muslim, and he was even one of those who used to oppress Muslims, he feels bad in that moment. And he says, it's funny, he's like pulling a donkey with him. He's pulling a mule with him. And he says, I'm sad that it's come to this. Even though he's a part of the problem, he's like, you know what, I'm a little sad that, that you guys are leaving. He says, like, Mecca needs people like you. And then he leaves. He goes back on his way. So now the two people who are leaving, the wife and the husband, the wife says to the husband, I think Umar could accept Islam. Like, I feel some sincerity from him. The husband looks at the wife and says, the donkey of Umar is more likely to accept Islam than Umar is. Like, there's no way. That was who Umar was before revelation. Right? They would literally say, like, his donkey is more Muslim than he is. Now one day, Umar is sitting in a gathering, the leaders of Mecca. And these leaders are all financially dependent on the idols. Right? They all rely on the idols for making their money. That's where all their money comes from. Right? So, you can make the parallels today about our world leaders and what they rely on financially, right? Like war and things like that. Their reliance on idol worship. So Umar is like hearing his the people he looks up to, and they're all saying, man, this Muhammad guy. And they don't know what to do about Muhammad, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, our prophet. So Umar gets up and he says, you know what? I'm going to take care of this problem. And he says, and he makes a plan to do something worse than any single person in this room has ever even thought of doing. He says, I'm going to go kill the prophet. I'm going to go kill Muhammad. So he gets his sword, he's battle ready, and he gets up to go. Now as he's walking, the Prophet Muhammad, he used to hang out in a spot, they call it Dar Arqam ibn Abi Arqam. The house of Arqam, the son of the father of Arqam. It's like kind of circular. And that was kind of like the hangout spot for the Muslims, right? So he's walking towards that house. And he's stopped by who he assumes is one of his friends, but that friend had secretly converted to Islam. So he's like a secret Muslim. And his friend stops him and he's like, Umar, where are you going? And Umar, thinking that he's not Muslim, he says, I'm going to go kill the Prophet. And he says, Umar, are you going to go kill the Prophet? And he thinks like, okay, how can I get Umar away from the Prophet? And he says, you're going to kill the Prophet when your sister and her husband are Muslim? Now imagine, you think like, someone says something about your family, how are you going to feel? Really upset, right? You're going to be like, oh, who are you talking to? So Umar gets angry, he's like, watch what you're saying. And this man says, go ask your sister. How are you going to ask about the house of Muhammad when your house isn't even sorted out? And all of us can relate how embarrassing that would be in that moment. So Umar, he gets a little upset, he gets angry, and he goes towards his sister's house. Now in the house is Umar radiallahu anhu's brother-in-law, sister, and unbeknownst to Umar, a Sahaba named Khabbab ibn al-Arat radiallahu anhu. Now Khabbab himself is very interesting. He's one of the first people to convert to Islam. Some people say he was the 9th person to convert to Islam. And he was a person who was in a very low state in terms of society. He was a slave. And when people had found out he converted to Islam, the torture he went through is something like, we can't even imagine. Once, many, many years later, after Islam had conquered Mecca and had begun to conquer, more of the world, years later, Umar and Khabbab would sit together again. And Umar says to Khabbab, he says, who do you think went through the most of the Muslims, the most pain? And Umar says, I think it was Bilal. We all know the story of Bilal. We all love the story of Bilal and the strength he shows. But Khabbab says, I don't know what Bilal went through, but I can show you what I went through. And Khabbab, this Sahaba, he lifts up his shirt and his back. They say that there was no flesh on his back because Khabbab was a blacksmith. And when he accepted Islam, the people who owned him would take the coals that he used to, break steel with and place it on his back until the flesh was cooked off his back. That's who Khabbab was. So you can imagine someone who has gone through this type of torture, if they hear Umar is coming, they're not going to be happy. So Umar goes to the house of his sister and he knocks on the door. Khabbab is in there teaching Quran to the sister of Umar. Can you imagine the fear he felt? So when they ask, who is it? And Umar says, Umar. He gets up and he goes and he hides in the closet. He's like, I'm not going to deal with that guy. Maybe he said that. So so he goes and he hides in the closet of the house. He doesn't want to see Umar, but he can hear and he can see Umar, but Umar can't see him. And Umar comes in the house. And he sees very clearly the sister, Umar's sister, she takes a couple pages and she hides them. So he's like, what are you doing? She's like, what do you want? Siblings. And he's like, I heard you became Muslim. She's like, what's it to you? And they go back and forth, back and forth. And Umar, he's already angry. And he's becoming angrier and angrier and angrier. And he just snaps. And he goes and he slaps his sister. Now, that moment, when he sees his sister on the floor, and when he sees what he's done, it calms him down. And then when she falls over after being slapped, she kind of drops a couple pages she's reading, just some scrap paper. So Umar goes, let me see that paper. And he's calm. Now imagine, put yourself in her shoes for a moment. You've just been attacked by an angry man. You don't really know what's going on. At that moment, she shows such strength and resilience. She says, no, I'm not going to let you see. You need to go, you're in a state of impurity, you need to go wash up, take ghusl, take a shower, and then come back. Imagine, that's the power of an older sister. No matter what's going on, she's gonna, hone him in. So he's like, all right. So he goes, takes ghusl, and there's actually such wisdom in that. As we were talking the Fajr Khatira, one of the advices the Prophet Muhammad gave to someone when they're angry is to either make wudu or do ghusl, because it calms them down. Water is something that calms people down. So in doing this, Umar comes back and he's more calm. And then she comes and she gives him the pages. And in the pages is written, طه ما أنزلنا عليك القرآن لتشقى إلا تذكرة لمن يخشى. This Quran that amazed him once, he's reading it again. And in Surah Taha, and he's amazed. He's like, this is crazy. And he can't believe it, and he's turning page after page after page, and he can't believe what he's reading. And then he finishes what they have, and he says, I want to go talk to Muhammad. He goes and he's interested in Islam. So I want to talk to Muhammad. And at this moment, Khabbab ibn al-Arat, our hidden figure, realizes the perfect time to emerge. So he comes out and he says, Umar, the Prophet said you would do this. First of all, he's kind of dumbfounded that Khabbab is even there. But then he's like, what do you mean? And then Khabbab says, I heard the Prophet Muhammad say, Allahumma a'izz al-Islam bi-hab al-umarayn ilayk. Amr ibn Hashim or Amr ibn al-Khattab. The Prophet Muhammad said, Ya Allah, O Allah, strengthen Islam with whichever Umar you like better. Amr ibn Hisham, who was Abu Jahl, or Umar ibn al-Khattab. And the Sahaba knew when the Prophet Muhammad makes dua, it's answered. So Umar hears this and he's like, first of all, imagine someone you hate saying something good about you. First of all, so he's happy. He's like, wow, the Prophet said he wants me to be Muslim. So he's happy. And then it's even another thing that he's like, what is this Islam thing? What is this thing I've been hating? So from reading the words of Surah Taha, he goes from someone who was adamant on not just like attacking the Prophet, killing the Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, to now he wants to go and just talk to the Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So he goes back on his original path. And he goes to the house of Arqam, where the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is. Now, he knocks at the door. Like, who is it? Again, Umar. And one of the Sahabas asked, is Umar, like, what does he have with him? And like, Umar's got his sword with him. Because remember, he took his sword out, it's with him. So, they're like, what do we do? Umar is here with his sword, are we just going to let him in? And then Hamza, the uncle of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who in his own right is like, amazing, he says, let Umar in. And if he wants shar, if he wants to do something bad, if he wants evil, I'll kill him with his own sword. Very like tough moment, mashallah. That's Hamza, right? Asadullah, the lion of Allah. No fear. So Umar comes in, but they're used to seeing Umar the proud. They're used to seeing Umar the great. They're used to seeing Umar come in with his chest puffed up, chest up to his nose, standing tall. But they see Umar and he's almost defeated. He's confused. He doesn't know he's in a different state than they've ever seen him. So the Prophet Muhammad recognizes this immediately. And he's like, you know what, something's different. So he takes him to the side room of the house. And before Umar can even, say anything, now, keep in mind the Prophet Muhammad was average height. And Umar radiallahu anhu was tall. So, there's the dynamic of looking up. So the Prophet Muhammad grabs his shirt collar and pulls him down. And he says, Ya Umar, when will you accept Islam? Ya Umar, when is your time to accept Islam? And he starts shaking him. Because, when you deal with someone strong, you need to be strong. And in that moment, Umar says, at that moment I knew. And he takes his shahada. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa ashhadu annaka Rasulullah. And the Prophet Muhammad said, Allahu Akbar. And when the Prophet says Allahu Akbar, the whole house knows what's going on. They're all screaming Allahu Akbar. Now, because of what Umar read that day, the Quran Umar read that day, he flipped from going to want to kill the Prophet to accepting Islam to now what happens? The Muslims say, after the day Umar accepted Islam, we started walking outside proudly. We stopped hiding. They say after the day Umar accepted Islam, we started praying in front of the Kaaba, in front of the non-believers. Because we know Umar was like, no one can fight Umar. No one can topple Umar. And Umar himself was like, he wasn't hiding. There's a narration where Umar says like he used to go knock on the door of all the disbelievers. He would say, I accept Islam, by the way. Like, any problems? And they would just go inside and hide because no one wants to fight Umar. He'd go door by door by door because that's Umar. They say about Umar that when everyone was doing hijrah to Medina, it was like a very secret night mission, right? Everyone's like going away in the night. Everyone's, trying to figure out how not to get caught. Umar goes on top of the Mount Safa and he says, I'm going to Medina. He announces it. It's like public announcement. I'm going to Medina. And he says, whoever, wishes that their wives be widows and their sons be raised without fathers, come follow me. Right? That's the strength Umar brought to Islam. But where does that change come from? Right? Where does that shift come from? It doesn't come from, there's no secret to it, right? Like everyone's looking for the shortcut. But there's no shortcut. It comes from the word of Allah Ta'ala. Allah Ta'ala says in the Quran, أَلَمْ يَأْنِ لِلَّذِينَ آمَنُوا أَن تَخْشَعَ قُلُوبُهُمْ لِذِكْرِ اللَّهِ وَمَا نَزَلَ مِنَ الْحَقِّ وَلَا يَكُونُوا كَالَّذِينَ أُوتُوا الْكِتَابَ مِنْ قَبْلِ فَطَالَ عَلَيْهِمُ الْأَمَدُ فَقَسَتْ قُلُوبُهُمْ وَكَثِيرٌ مِّنْهُمْ فَاسِقُونَ. Allah Ta'ala says, is it not time for us believing people, right, for the believers, us, that we turn our hearts to remember Allah and what Allah Ta'ala has sent to us? We, being a part of this Western world, this Western society, we've kind of lost our sense of urgency, right? When you're young, you're like, I have college now, I have classes now, I have this to do, that to do. I don't really have time to get to the Quran. But when I'm done with college, when I get into my work, okay, now I'm going to start, I'm going to start getting my Quran in. And then when you start in the workplace, you're like, I just started off here, This is my first internship. I need to do it well. So I'm not going to be able to read Quran as much. But, when I'm more established, then I'll start reading Quran more. And then now that you're more established in the future, a couple years pass, you're like, you know what, now I might, I'm not in where I was before, but now I have a wife and kids. And, they're always crying, they're always fussy. So maybe when the kids get older, I'm going to start, reading Quran more. And the kids get older and you're like, you know what, something else comes up. And all of a sudden you reach old age and you realize you never gave time for the Quran. That's human nature. That's the human cycle. But Allah Ta'ala asks us, all the blessings we've been given, all the ni'mah Allah Ta'ala has given us. The Prophet Muhammad said that if you have food for the day, shelter for the night, clothes on your back, you're wealthy, right? We forget food for the day. We have food for the year in our fridges, right? We have our fridges stocked up and down, left and right. We have food for the year. We have so many clothes that they don't fit in the closet. We got a second, third closet, right? How many blessings we've been given. But Allah Ta'ala asks us, is it not time for us to turn our hearts to the Quran? Is it not time for us to turn our minds to the remembrance of Allah? And then He warns us what happens, right? If you don't do this, what will happen? Then you will become like those who were sent books before, right? The Christians and the Jewish people. فَطَالَ عَلَيْهِمُ الْأَمَدُ. They began to read the Quran less and less, or their books less and less. And their hearts, what was the consequence? What happens when we let go of the Quran? What happens when the Quran is no longer a part of our lives? قَسَتْ قُلُوبُهُمْ. Their hearts became hard. Their hearts became hard, meaning what? They would hear remembrance of Allah and it wouldn't affect them. Nothing would bother them. They would hear remembrance of people being, persecuted and harmed and attacked, and they would say, I'm not harmed, so who cares? And their hearts closed off from Allah. And due to that, كَثِيرٌ مِّنْهُمْ فَاسِقُونَ. They became open sinners. They forgot about Allah. They stopped caring about Allah. Now, Allah Ta'ala is asking us, every single person. There's a narration, Umar said that whenever he would read an ayah of the Quran, before he read it, he would say, Ya Umar, and then he would read the ayah. Because the ayah, just like the Quran was revealed to the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, it was revealed for every single one of us. So put your name in front of that ayah. Isn't it time for me to remember Allah? Isn't it time for me to read the Quran? To dedicate time to the Quran in my day, even if it's inconvenient? Isn't it time for me to humble myself in front of the words of Allah? And not to become like those whose hearts have hardened. Now, my takeaway, what's the takeaway here, right? What's the point? Every single one of us now should be taking stock of our lives. What do I do in a day? What do I do when I wake up? What do I do before I go to sleep? Am I dedicating time to the Quran? Am I dedicating time to the remembrance of Allah? They say, there's a famous saying, the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time is today. You can have regret, you can have remorse over the time you've missed, but there's nothing more powerful than starting today. Every single one of us should have a consistent daily routine with the Quran. Now, one of the tricks of shaitan is that he tells us that unless you do a lot of something, it's not worth it, right? Shaitan will come and he'll say that, you need to read a juz a day. And if you can't read a juz a day, your Quran's not worth anything. So we start thinking, I need to read a juz a day. And you read, first day you read one juz, second day you read one juz, third day you get caught up, fourth, and then all of a sudden you fall off. Because shaitan knows us. Shaitan knows that it's easy to set a big goal when you have a lot of energy, but as the days go, it's hard. So we all know ourselves. It's time for each of us to just set a reasonable amount of Quran and translation to read every day if we don't understand the Arabic. You all know yourselves, you all know what you have. For some of us, it's an ayah a day. Right? For some of us, it's just one ayah every day. For some of us, it's one page a day. For some of us, it's half a page a day. Whatever you can do, do it. But make sure you do it every single day. So your heart never has a chance to harden. I'll close with this. The Prophet Muhammad ﷺ said, أحب الأعمال إلى الله. The most beloved action to Allah. Right? When we think about the most beloved actions to Allah, we think about like jihad, we think about Hajj, we think about Ramadan and fasting through Ramadan, we think about standing in Qiyam al-Layl and Tahajjud. But the Prophet ﷺ kind of takes that and flips it on his head. He says, أحب الأعمال إلى الله أدومها وإن قل. The most beloved action to Allah. The most beloved action to Allah is something consistent, even if you find it small. Even if you think it's small, because it could be large in the eyes of Allah Ta'ala. So we pray that Allah Ta'ala allows us to become people of the Quran. We pray that Allah Ta'ala allows us to put the Quran in our everyday life. It's not enough for us to just read the Quran and have these empty words. The Quran is here for us to read the Arabic, if we understand the Arabic, and the English, if we don't understand the English, and to act on it. So we ask Allah Ta'ala that He allows us to become people who act on the Quran. We ask Allah Ta'ala that He raises us up on the Day of Judgment with the Ahl Quran, those who gave time to the Quran. And we ask Allah Ta'ala that He forgives us for our shortcomings with the Quran and accepts from us every harf, every letter, every word we read from it. Ameen ya Rabbil Alameen. I think we had to open it for Q&A if anyone has any questions. So, yeah. So the practice of having a dedicated daily regimen of like what we would call like adhkar and like prophetic ayat the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ would read is very, very important, right? After every prayer, reading Ayatul Kursi, when you wake up, before you're going to sleep, reading your 3 quls and Ayatul Kursi and the last 2 ayahs of Surah Baqarah and Surah Mulk as well. Right? These things are very important. But the Quran is not just those parts, right? So when you only focus on those parts, then you're missing out on such amazing, lessons and stories and Quran Allah Ta'ala has revealed with you in mind, right? And something we often forget about, but the Quran is every single part of it speaks to every single part of every person, right? So every single ayah was revealed to you, and every single ayah has a connection to you. Allah Ta'ala, put every ayah in a way that even you have benefit in it, right? There's no ayah that isn't made with you in mind. There's no ayah that's there without you in mind. So it's on us to start to, not only do the beginning and end of the Quran, but the middle as well, right? A lot of times we're very good on like 30th juz, and then, we'll get our Surah Baqarah in, but like, when's the last time we read like Surah Anfal, Surah An'am? Inshallah, we're good with like Surah Yusuf. Surah Ma'idah needs its love too, right? So going through the Quran page by page, even if it takes you a year, let it be progress, because progress is progress, right? So I think having even 5 minutes a day, 10 minutes a day, some regimen of reading the Quran from a mushaf is important. Even if it's just 5 minutes, right? Anybody else? Yeah. I don't think there's more reward, but I would ward against reading from your phone just because distractions are there. Like you're not getting, there's no notifications on a book. You can't scroll down. No TikToks on a book. There's no TikTok anywhere, I guess. Yeah. Huh? What'd you say? Oh, it's back? SubhanAllah, man. So when you have the mushaf, it kind of like, it saves you from distraction, right? I remember one of the ulama, not a alim, but one of my Quran teachers, he would say that if you lose your focus, it takes you 10 minutes to get it back. So let's say you're reading Quran and like you get a text from your boy and you're like, oh, now you have to reset and you're out of the mode. So I think reading from a physical book as well, your eyes will thank you as well. Yeah, inshallah. But reading from a phone is better than reading from nothing, right? Like if you like, it's not like you forgot your mushaf at home, so you're like, you know what, I'm free. No, do your best, inshallah. There are levels to reading, and both of them are beneficial. So the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ says in a hadith that the one who can read Quran, and he's very fluent, right? He's very like, he reads it and it's like, he's like our Sheikh Ibrahim. MashaAllah, he's like he hears himself reading, he's like, MashaAllah. Right? For that person, they get the companionship of angels. Ma'al kiram al-barar. Right? They're with the angels. But for the person who reads the Quran and he's stuttering, and it's very hard for him, right? Arabic's not his native tongue, so he stutters and he stumbles, and it's very hard, it's difficult. They get double the reward of the person who reads fast. They get the reward of reading, and they get the reward of struggling through reading. Yeah. Yeah, reading. But even like reading, some people, they struggle with even like just that much, right? Yeah. Difficult. Alhamdulillah. Any other questions from? Yes.
Prophet ﷺ, he didn't know how to read when it was revealed to him. How come Prophet Umar, Hazrat Umar started reading on the pages when he got those pages?
So there were certain people in Meccan society who could read and certain who couldn't, right? So we know like Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, for example, he could read. And certain other Sahaba like Zayd bin Thabit, if I remember correctly, there were certain Sahaba, Uthman radiallahu anhu, they could read and write. This ability to read and write in Arabia was very rare for a number of reasons. First, because ink and pen were very expensive to actually have those materials. And second, it wasn't like a very common thing, right? The Prophet Muhammad was a shepherd and then a businessman, right? So he had no, really there was no benefit to him reading. As well as the people back then, they had amazing memories, right? They say that a child from the time of the Prophet Muhammad would know his own lineage back to back so many generations. And then he would know his horse's lineage back so many generations. So not only, their memories were incredible. They had no need for it. Yeah. So sisters, any questions? So I feel like I'm just on this side. Yeah. That's a really good question. I've never studied that. I've never read it, so I wouldn't really. I'd have to read it before I can answer, inshallah. That's a good question. I'll keep it in. I'll go research it now. You gave me homework, man. Any other questions? Yes.
The story that you mentioned at the beginning of the Sahaba who left the city.
Yeah. Yes. We do know the name of the Sahaba, but it's not like the name of the Sahaba isn't authentically mentioned. We know it through some level of possibility, but we know the Sahaba, we know that authentically the story happened. The Sahaba is a little, from what at least when I read, is not as, the name of the Sahaba isn't as authentic. Yeah.
I was just reflecting, it's the same exact question.
Yeah.
When you were sharing the story of Umar, how the transformative nature of the Quran on the heart of a non-Muslim, on the one who hated it.
Yeah.
I'm just curious, we do a lot of da'wah in town.
Yeah.
What, suggestions do you have in terms of how we use the Quran in our da'wah efforts? Right? There's all these viral videos of
Yeah.
non-Muslims listen to the Quran.
Yeah.
Different techniques. I'm just curious.
So, if you guys know, one of my teachers, his name is Sheikh Mikhail Smith. Oh, sorry. If you guys know one of my teachers, his name is Sheikh Mikhail Smith, right? Ahmed Smith. And he himself is a convert, right? He's a revert from Christianity to Islam. And I remember he told this to us, and it always stuck with me. He said sometimes in da'wah, unknowingly, we put ourselves in front of the Quran. Meaning we almost we block off the access to the Quran and we put ourselves as a barrier. But the biggest tool for Muslims to accept Islam and for non-Muslims to even think about Islam and to accept Islam is to just read the Quran cover to cover. Anyone who, of course there are people who read it and they're they have militia and they're just trying to disprove Islam. But anyone who reads the Quran with an open heart will find it to be beautiful. There's a story, there's one of the enemies of Islam actually. His name is Walid ibn Mughira, right? He's the father of Khalid ibn Walid, non-Muslim. He never accepted Islam. One time he goes to like almost debate the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He goes to the Prophet and he's like, I don't want you to be bringing this Islam stuff around here. So he tries to make a deal with the Prophet. He says, okay, he's in charge of Mecca. He'll say, I'll give you any woman you want to marry. You can marry her. Prophet says, I'm not interested. He has Khadijah. He doesn't need anybody. He says, any wealth you want, I'll give you. Like, we can put all our money together. We'll give you everything. And he's like, I don't need money. And then he goes, well, we can make you the leader of Mecca. We'll make you the leader of Mecca if you leave Islam. And he says, there's no leaving. I'm not here for leadership. And as a response, the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ starts to read Quran. He starts to read Quran. And they say Walid ibn Mughira, he heard the Quran and he walked out of the house of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. And the other, like Abu Jahl comes and his friends come. He's like, what's up? And he's like starstruck. And then he goes in his house and he stays there for days. That was the effects of the Quran on someone who hated Islam. Imagine if someone is open-minded, open-hearted, and they just read a translation of the Quran. What effect it would have on them. So I think like a good tool in da'wah is to just give a translation of the Quran and say, read it cover to cover. Read the Quran, but don't just read the parts that are like controversial, right? Read it from beginning to end. And of course, there's no qualm they can have, and there's no qualm we can have. And then the rest is up to Allah Ta'ala. But the Quran is the strongest source of da'wah, right? I mean, the two strongest sources of da'wah are Quran and good character. And that's all you have to do. Give them the Quran and show up with a smile. Inshallah. You don't need all the debating tactics. You leave that for Muhammad Hijab. Any other questions, inshallah? Questions this side, that side? Going once. All right, Jazakumullah khair, everybody. Keep me in your du'as, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum.